I'm Elena, and at 32 years old, I never imagined I'd be planning my husband's funeral. 3 weeks ago, I lost Marcus, my husband of 9 years, to a sudden heart attack. Just hours after we laid him to rest, my younger sister Rachel dropped a bombshell that nearly shattered what was left of my world. She claimed her 18-month-old son Jake was actually Marcus's child and presented what she said was his will, demanding half of our $650,000 home. What she didn't know was why I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing out loud. Marcus and I met 10 years ago at a charity gala for pediatric cancer research. I was working as an event coordinator, and he was there representing his accounting firm. When the auction started, he bid aggressively on a painting I'd been admiring all evening, a beautiful landscape of our city's riverside at dawn. After winning, he walked straight over and handed it to me. "I noticed you staring at this all night," he said with that gentle smile that made his green eyes light up. "I think it belongs with someone who truly appreciates it." That was Marcus. Thoughtful, observant, generous. We had our first date the next weekend, and it felt like we'd known each other forever. He was brilliant with numbers but humble about his success, the kind of man who remembered every server's name and asked about their families. Marcus had grown up in a working-class family, the first to attend college, and he never forgot where he came from. His parents had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities they never had, working double shifts at the factory and the diner to pay for his education. 7 months after we met, he proposed by that same riverside, with the actual view matching the painting that had brought us together. The proposal was perfect. He'd arranged for the painting to be displayed on an easel nearby, and as the sun set, painting the sky in the same oranges and purples as the artwork, he got down on one knee. "I want to spend every sunset with you," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "Will you marry me?" Our wedding was small but perfect, held in the garden of my parents' home with close family and friends. Marcus's parents had flown in from Michigan, his mother weeping happy tears as she watched her son marry the woman he loved. My parents adored Marcus from the moment they met him. My father appreciated his work ethic and integrity, while my mother was charmed by his old-fashioned manners and the way he clearly cherished me. We bought our colonial-style house in Riverside Heights 2 years after our wedding. At $650,000, it stretched our budget, but Marcus had just been promoted to senior partner at his accounting firm, and my event planning business was starting to take off. The house needed work, but it had character: original hardwood floors from the 1920s, a stone fireplace that dominated the living room, crown molding throughout, and a backyard with mature oak trees perfect for the children we hoped to have someday. We threw ourselves into renovations with the enthusiasm of newlyweds building their dream home. Weekends found us at home improvement stores, debating paint colors and tile choices. Marcus, despite being hopeless with tools, insisted on helping with every project. I still smile remembering him attempting to install bathroom fixtures, cursing creatively as I held the flashlight. "Maybe we should call a professional," I'd suggest after particularly colorful language. "Absolutely not," he'd reply with mock seriousness. "Real men install their own toilets." Then he'd kiss my forehead and admit defeat, calling his handyman friend Tony. Those children we dreamed about never came, despite years of hoping and trying. The journey was heartbreaking: months of careful timing and disappointment, then fertility specialists with their clinical terminology and invasive procedures. We went through 2 rounds of IVF, depleting our savings and our emotional reserves. The second failure hit particularly hard. I remember sitting in the clinic parking lot afterward, both of us crying, knowing we couldn't afford to try again. "We can still have a beautiful life," Marcus said that night as we sat on our back porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "You and me, that's more than enough," and he meant it. We slowly rebuilt our dreams around each other, channeling our love into our careers, travel, and gradually renovating our home into something beautiful. Marcus threw himself into work with renewed purpose, taking on additional clients and building a reputation as one of the most ethical and thorough CPAs in the city. His specialty became helping small businesses navigate complex tax situations, and he was known for going above and beyond for his clients. More than once, I found him at the kitchen table at midnight, poring over someone's books, determined to save them every legitimate dollar possible. My event planning business flourished as well. Word spread about my attention to detail and ability to handle crisis with grace. I specialized in nonprofit galas and corporate events, finding meaning in helping organizations raise money for causes I believed in. The work was demanding but fulfilling, especially when I could see the direct impact: a children's hospital getting new equipment, a scholarship fund reaching its goal, a food bank expanding its services. Rachel had always been a complicated presence in our lives. 4 years younger than me, she'd been the family wild child while I was the responsible older sister. Where I built a steady business and stable marriage, Rachel bounced between jobs and relationships, always finding drama wherever she went. Our parents constantly worried about her, which usually translated to them making excuses for her behavior and bailing her out of various financial and emotional crises. From childhood, Rachel had been beautiful and charming, the kind of person who could talk her way out of trouble with a smile. Teachers loved her despite her poor grades, employers overlooked her tardiness because of her personality, and men fell for her magnetic energy. But there was always an underlying current of chaos following her around like a storm cloud. She'd had a string of jobs: retail sales, restaurant work, receptionist positions, but nothing ever lasted more than a few months. There was always some reason why it wasn't her fault. The manager was incompetent, co-workers were jealous, the work was beneath her capabilities. Our parents would nod sympathetically and help her financially until she found the next opportunity. Rachel had always been competitive with me, though I tried not to let it affect our relationship. When I started my business, she suddenly developed an interest in event planning, though she never followed through on actually pursuing it. When Marcus and I bought our house, she complained for months about her cramped studio apartment until our parents helped her move to a better place in a trendy neighborhood she couldn't afford. The pattern was exhausting but familiar. Rachel would see something in my life she wanted, make noise about it, receive attention and assistance from our parents, then move on to the next thing. It was as if she couldn't bear for me to have anything she didn't also possess. Marcus, to his credit, tried to build a genuine relationship with my sister. He included her in conversations, asked about her interests, and treated her with the same kindness he showed everyone. But he was also observant, and I could tell he noticed things about Rachel that concerned him: the way she exaggerated stories for attention, how she always seemed to need something whenever she visited, the subtle ways she competed with me even in casual conversation. "She's struggling to find her place," he'd say when I expressed frustration about Rachel's latest drama. "Some people take longer to figure things out. She's your only sister, we should try to be supportive." 2 years ago, Rachel started dating Connor Mackenzie, a musician she met at a downtown bar where he played with his band twice a week. Connor was undeniably attractive, tall and lean with dark hair, intricate tattoos covering his arms, and the kind of brooding intensity that attracted certain women like a magnet. He rode a motorcycle and had the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about steady employment or long-term planning. Our parents were nervous about Connor from the moment Rachel brought him home for Sunday dinner. He was polite but distant, giving the impression that he was tolerating our bourgeois family gathering rather than enjoying it. Dad tried to engage him in conversation about his music, but Connor's answers were brief and slightly condescending. Mom offered him seconds on her famous pot roast, and he declined with barely concealed disdain, mentioning he was mostly vegetarian these days. Rachel seemed energized by our parents' obvious discomfort with Connor. She'd lean against him possessively during family gatherings, laugh loudly at his sardonic comments, and defend him fiercely whenever anyone expressed concern about their relationship. Their romance was volatile from the outside, with dramatic breakups followed by passionate reconciliations that Rachel would describe in exhausting detail. One week she'd be sobbing on my couch, explaining how Connor had disappeared for 3 days without explanation. The next week she'd be glowing, showing off expensive jewelry he'd bought to apologize, paid for with money from his irregular gigs and sources I didn't want to examine too closely. "He's an artist," she'd say when I gently expressed concern. "Artists are complicated. You wouldn't understand because Marcus is so predictable." The backhanded insult stung, but I let it slide. Marcus was predictable in the best ways: reliable, honest, emotionally stable. If that made him boring in Rachel's eyes, I considered it a compliment. Then came the pregnancy announcement at Christmas dinner the year before Marcus died. Rachel waited until we'd finished Mom's traditional prime rib and were settling in with coffee and dessert. She stood up, Connor remaining seated with an expression I couldn't quite read, and tapped her wine glass with a fork. "Connor and I have an announcement," she said, her voice bright with theatrical excitement. "We're going to have a baby." The silence that followed was deafening. Mom's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Dad's fork clattered against his plate. I felt my stomach drop, that familiar stab of jealousy and grief that still hit whenever someone announced a pregnancy. "Surprise," Rachel added when no one immediately responded, her smile faltering slightly at our stunned faces. Mom recovered first, jumping up to hug Rachel with tears in her eyes. "Oh honey, that's wonderful news. When are you due?" As Rachel basked in the attention, fielding questions about due dates and doctor visits, I caught Connor's expression in my peripheral vision. He didn't look like a man celebrating impending fatherhood. He looked trapped, almost resentful, picking at his dessert while Rachel chattered about nursery themes and baby names. Marcus reached under the table to squeeze my hand, understanding without words what this announcement meant to me. After all our struggles, all our heartbreak, Rachel had accidentally achieved what we desperately wanted. But I pushed those feelings down, determined to be supportive. This was my nephew or niece, and I would love this child regardless of my complicated feelings about the circumstances. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Rachel complained constantly about every symptom. She called me frequently with questions and concerns, often in tears about morning sickness, back pain, or Connor's increasing absence from home. "He says the baby crying is just noise," she sobbed during one late-night call when she was 7 months along. "How can he call his own child noise?" I drove over that night, finding Rachel curled up on her couch surrounded by tissues and empty ice cream containers. Connor was nowhere to be seen, and Rachel explained he'd stormed out after an argument about baby preparations. "He doesn't want to buy a crib," she wailed. "Says babies can sleep anywhere for the first few months." We spent the next day shopping for baby essentials, my credit card taking a significant hit as I helped Rachel stock up on everything from diapers to a car seat. It felt both wonderful and heartbreaking to prepare for a baby's arrival, but I pushed through the conflicted emotions, focusing on being the supportive sister and aunt to be. Jake was born on a snowy February morning, weighing 7 pounds 11 ounces. I was at the hospital with flowers and the handmade blanket I'd spent months knitting in soft blue and green stripes. Rachel looked exhausted but radiant, holding this tiny perfect person who had her dark eyes and a shock of light brown hair. Connor was there for the birth but left shortly afterward, claiming he needed to sleep before his gig that night. I stayed with Rachel through her first night as a mother, helping with feedings and diaper changes, marveling at this new little person who was now part of our family. From the beginning, Rachel seemed overwhelmed by motherhood. She'd call me in tears about Jake's colic, her exhaustion, or Connor's continued absence. I stepped in as much as I could, sometimes keeping Jake overnight so she could sleep, bringing meals when she was too tired to cook, helping with laundry and cleaning when her apartment became chaotic. Marcus was less involved with Jake than I was, and I understood why. Our fertility struggles had left invisible scars, and being around a healthy baby was sometimes painful for him. He was always kind when Rachel brought Jake over, but he maintained a careful emotional distance that I never questioned. I assumed it was his way of protecting himself from getting too attached to a child that wasn't ours. What I didn't know then was that Marcus had much more complicated reasons for keeping his distance from both Jake and Rachel. The first sign that something was wrong came about 6 months after Jake was born. Rachel had called me in tears, saying she needed someone to watch Jake for a few hours while she handled some business downtown. When I arrived at her apartment, she was dressed up more than usual and seemed nervous, checking her phone constantly. "Where's Connor?" I asked, settling Jake in his bouncy seat. "Working," she said quickly, not meeting my eyes. "He's been picking up extra gigs. Money's tight with the baby and everything." After she left, I tried calling Connor's phone to ask when he'd be back, wanting to coordinate dinner plans. The number was disconnected. When I asked Rachel about it later, she brushed it off, saying he'd switched carriers and forgot to give her the new number. Over the following weeks, I noticed other concerning signs. Rachel seemed to have money for nice clothes and highlights at an expensive salon, but claimed she couldn't afford Jake's daycare or doctor visits. When I offered to help with medical expenses, she became defensive, insisting she could handle everything herself. Connor's presence became increasingly sporadic. He'd disappear for days at a time, then show up unexpectedly, usually when Rachel seemed to have extra money. During one of Jake's overnight stays at my house, Marcus made an observation that stuck with me. Something's not right with Rachel's situation, he said as we watched Jake sleep in the portable crib we'd set up in our spare room. The math doesn't add up. She's unemployed, Connor barely works, but she's buying designer baby clothes and eating at expensive restaurants. I defended my sister, but Marcus's accountant mind was already working through the numbers. I'm not judging, he said carefully. I'm worried. People in desperate financial situations sometimes make choices they wouldn't normally make. That conversation proved more prophetic than either of us realized. Then came that devastating Tuesday morning in March. Marcus had been working late the night before, stress eating antacids and rubbing his chest occasionally. I'd suggested he see a doctor about what seemed like ongoing indigestion, but he insisted it was just work pressure from tax season. He woke up complaining of chest pain that felt different from his usual heartburn. Maybe you should stay home today, I suggested, noting how pale he looked. I can't. The Morrison audit is due, and they're depending on me to find the discrepancy before their board meeting. He kissed my forehead, tasting of coffee and determination. I'll call you after I get through the morning meetings. That call never came. Instead, my phone rang at 11:47 a.m. with words that changed my life forever. Mrs. Chen? This is St. Mary's Hospital. Your husband has been brought to our emergency room. You need to come immediately. By the time I arrived, Marcus was already gone. Massive heart attack at his desk, his secretary finding him slumped over the Morrison files he'd been reviewing. The doctors explained it was genetic, a silent killer that could strike anyone, anytime, without warning. At 35 years old, Marcus had seemed invincible. We'd planned on decades together, children or no children, growing old in our beautiful house with our carefully tended dreams. The days following Marcus's death blurred together in a haze of arrangements and grief. I moved through funeral planning like a zombie, making decisions about flowers and eulogies while feeling completely disconnected from reality. The house filled with casseroles and cards from friends and clients, all expressing their shock at losing someone so young and vital. Rachel was strangely absent during most of the funeral preparations. She sent texts claiming Jake was sick with a stomach bug and she couldn't find a babysitter, but didn't offer to help with any of the planning or arrangements. When she did appear at the funeral, she stayed briefly in the back, wearing dark sunglasses and leaving before the reception began. At the time, I was too numb with grief to think much about her behavior. People grieve differently, I told myself. Maybe being around death was too difficult for her with a young child to think about. But 3 days after we buried Marcus, Rachel called insisting we needed to meet urgently. There are things about Marcus you need to know, she said, her voice carrying an odd mixture of nervousness and excitement. Things that affect Jake's future. She arrived at my house that afternoon carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression I'd never seen before, confident, almost predatory, like a cat that had cornered a mouse. She'd dressed carefully in a black dress that was appropriate for mourning but also flattering, her hair freshly styled and makeup perfectly applied. Elena, she said, settling into Marcus's favorite leather recliner without invitation, there's something you need to know about Jake. Something Marcus should have told you before he died. My stomach dropped, sensing disaster approaching like a storm on the horizon. What do you mean? Rachel took a deep breath, as if steadying herself for a performance. Marcus is Jake's father. We had an affair about 2 years ago, starting before Jake was conceived and continuing until I got pregnant. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but Marcus wanted Jake provided for. The words hit me like physical blows. I stared at my sister, trying to process what she was saying. She was claiming she'd had an affair with my husband, that my nephew was actually Marcus's child, that everything I'd believed about my marriage was a lie. I started, then stopped, unable to form coherent thoughts. I know it's a shock. Rachel continued, pulling a document from her folder with hands that trembled slightly. But Marcus was a good man. Before he died, he updated his will to make sure Jake would be taken care of. This states that Jake, as Marcus's biological son, is entitled to half of the house and assets. She handed me the document with ceremonial gravity. It was typed on official-looking letterhead with what appeared to be Marcus's signature at the bottom, witnessed and notarized. But something was immediately wrong to my eyes, something that made my grief-clouded mind suddenly sharp and focused. The language was clunky and imprecise, nothing like the careful legal documents Marcus brought home from his practice. Technical terms were used incorrectly, and the phrasing was awkward in ways that would have made Marcus, with his perfectionist tendencies, cringe. More importantly, the signature was wrong, similar, but missing the small flourishes and connections. That made Marcus's signature uniquely his. The M was too angular. The connection between Marcus and Chen was missing its characteristic loop. But beyond the obvious forgery, there was something else, something that made Rachel's entire story not just hurtful and shocking, but completely impossible. This is quite a shock, I managed, keeping my voice steady through years of practice managing crisis situations for my clients. I need some time to process this information. Rachel looked surprised by my calm reaction. Clearly, she'd been expecting tears, anger, immediate capitulation to her demands. Of course, she said, though I detected disappointment in her voice. But Elena, you need to understand Jake deserves his inheritance. This house is worth over $650,000 now. Marcus would want his son taken care of financially. I understand what you're saying, I replied carefully. But this is a lot to take in. Can we discuss the details later? I need to consult with an attorney about how to handle this properly. An attorney? Rachel's confidence flickered for just a moment. Why do you need an attorney? The will is clear. Any time there are questions about inheritances and children involved, legal counsel is appropriate, I said, falling back on the professional demeanor that had served me well in challenging situations. I want to make sure everything is handled correctly for everyone's sake, especially Jake's. After she left, I sat alone in my living room, the forged will on my coffee table like a poisonous thing. My sister had just accused my dead husband of infidelity and was attempting to steal half of everything we'd built together. But there was something Rachel didn't know, something that made her elaborate lie not just cruel, but biologically impossible. The truth about Marcus and Rachel's interactions began 3 years ago, but the medical reality that destroyed her story went back even further. When Marcus and I were struggling with fertility, we'd undergone extensive testing to understand why we couldn't conceive. The tests revealed that Marcus had a varicocele, enlarged veins in his scrotum that could affect fertility. The urologist recommended surgery to correct the condition, which we hoped might improve our chances of natural conception. The surgery went well, but during the recovery period, Marcus developed complications that required a second procedure. The varicocele had been more extensive than initially diagnosed, and the urologist recommended a vasectomy to prevent recurrence and protect Marcus's long-term health. It was a heartbreaking decision, especially given our fertility struggles. But the doctor explained that without the vasectomy, Marcus faced a high probability of needing multiple future surgeries with increasingly complicated recoveries. We agreed it was the right choice for his health and our future together. The vasectomy was performed 18 months before Jake was conceived, making it biologically impossible for Marcus to be the father. We kept this medical information completely private, even our parents didn't know. After years of invasive questions about our childlessness from well-meaning family and friends, we'd learned to guard our privacy fiercely around reproductive matters. The only people who knew about Marcus's vasectomy were Marcus, myself, and his doctors. But Marcus, being the thorough and cautious person he was, had been increasingly concerned about Rachel's behavior toward him in the months following his surgery. What started as friendly sisterly affection gradually became something more uncomfortable and inappropriate. Rachel began finding excuses to touch Marcus, lingering hugs, hands on his arm during conversation, sitting unusually close to him during family gatherings. She made comments about how lucky I was to have such a wonderful husband, with implications that perhaps I didn't appreciate him enough. The behavior escalated over time. Rachel started showing up at Marcus's office uninvited, bringing him coffee, and asking if he wanted to grab lunch. She sent text messages that walked the line between friendly and flirtatious, nothing overtly inappropriate that couldn't be explained away, but consistent enough to make Marcus uncomfortable. Marcus reported every incident to me immediately. We discussed creating distance from Rachel, declining invitations where we'd be thrown together, making sure they were never alone. But the behavior continued to escalate in subtle ways that were difficult to address directly without seeming paranoid or creating family drama. After one particularly uncomfortable incident where Rachel showed up at our house while I was at a client meeting and tried to invite herself in for wine to talk about Elena's birthday surprise, Marcus made a decision that would ultimately save me from her current scheme. I think we need to Document this, he told me that evening as we sat in our kitchen, going over the latest incident. Rachel is getting bolder, and I'm worried about where this is heading. If something ever happens to me, I want you to have protection. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. What do you mean, if something happens to you? You're 35 and healthy. Honey, I'm an accountant. I believe in planning for every contingency. He smiled, but his eyes were serious. My dad died of a heart attack at 50. My grandfather at 48. I hope I live to be 90, but I want to be prepared for any possibility. The next week, Marcus scheduled an appointment with our attorney, David Chen, no relation, despite sharing a surname. I went with him, listening as Marcus detailed Rachel's inappropriate behavior and his recent medical procedure. David was thorough, asking detailed questions about dates, witnesses, and documentation. You're right to be proactive about this, David told us. I've seen family disputes after deaths that could have been prevented with proper documentation. Let's create a comprehensive file. Following David's advice, we began documenting everything. Marcus kept a detailed journal of every inappropriate interaction with Rachel, including dates, times, locations, and exact quotes. We printed copies of text messages and emails she sent him. We stored copies of Marcus's medical records confirming the vasectomy and its date. Marcus updated his will properly through official channels, making sure everything would come to me with no ambiguity. David also recommended we get a safety deposit box to store the originals of all documents. Better to have documentation and never need it, he advised, than wish you had it later when it's too late to gather. We followed his advice meticulously. In addition to the legal documents, Marcus wrote me a letter to be placed in the box, something I wouldn't see unless I needed these materials after his death, just in case, he said when we locked the box at our bank. Though I planned to be around to deal with any of Rachel's drama personally for at least another 50 years. The morning after Rachel's visit with her forged will, I drove straight to the bank. The manager, Mr. Patterson, who had known Marcus and me for years, expressed his condolences as he led me to the safety deposit box vault. His hands shook slightly as he turned his key alongside mine. Even the bank staff had been shaken by Marcus's sudden death. Take all the time you need, Mrs. Chen, he said gently, leaving me alone in the small viewing room. Inside the box was exactly what I needed: Marcus's legitimate will, properly notarized and executed, leaving everything to me with no mention of children or other beneficiaries. Medical records detailing his vasectomy 18 months before Jake's conception. The detailed journal Marcus had kept documenting every inappropriate interaction with Rachel. Printed copies of text messages and emails she'd sent him. A letter from David confirming he had witnessed Marcus's legitimate will and was available to verify its authenticity. And at the bottom of the box, a sealed envelope with my name written in Marcus's familiar, careful handwriting. With trembling fingers, I opened the letter and began to read. My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, something has happened to me and you've needed to access these documents. I hope this day never comes, that we grow old together and Rachel's behavior becomes nothing but an uncomfortable memory we occasionally laugh about over dinner. But if the worst has happened and she has tried to hurt you in my absence, please know that I tried to prepare for every possibility. Use these documents to protect yourself and our life together. I know how much you value family, how loyal you are to those you love, but you deserve to be protected from those who would exploit that beautiful heart of yours. You are the love of my life, the best person I've ever known. Whatever Rachel claims, whatever lies she tells, remember that you were the only woman I ever truly loved, the only one I was ever faithful to. Our marriage was the best thing that ever happened to me. If you're reading this, I'm not there to protect you anymore. But maybe, in preparing these documents, I can still shield you from harm one last time. Don't let anyone tarnish what we had together. It was real, it was beautiful, and it was worth every moment. I love you beyond words, beyond time. Whatever happens, carry that with you always. Forever yours. Marcus. Tears stream down my face as I read his words, feeling his love and protection reaching across death to help me. My practical, thoughtful husband had anticipated this possibility and prepared for it with the same meticulous care he brought to everything else in his life. I carefully returned most items to the box, taking only what I needed: copies of the medical records, the legitimate will, selected journal entries, and the text message printouts. Then I called David Chen and scheduled an emergency appointment for that afternoon. David's law office occupied the second floor of a renovated Victorian building downtown, all dark wood and leather-bound books that spoke of tradition and discretion. His receptionist, Mrs. Rodriguez, had worked there for 20 years and knew both Marcus and me well. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw me. "Mrs. Chen, I was so sorry to hear about Marcus. He was such a good man." She ushered me into David's office immediately. Despite the fact that I was 15 minutes early, David greeted me with a warm embrace and genuine sorrow in his eyes. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired and dignified, the kind of lawyer who still believed in handshake deals and treating clients like family. "Sit down, Elena. Tell me what's happened." I explained Rachel's visit, her claims about the affair, and showed him the forged will. David examined it carefully through his reading glasses, his expression growing increasingly grave. "This is amateur work," he said finally, setting the document aside. "The legal language is completely wrong from Massachusetts law. The formatting doesn't match standard will templates, and I can tell just by looking that the signature is forged. But the fact that she created this at all is deeply concerning." I showed him the documents from the safety deposit box, Marcus's medical records, the legitimate will, the journal entries, and text messages. David reviewed everything methodically, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. Marcus was incredibly thorough, he said when he finished. "These medical records alone completely disprove her claim about paternity. The vasectomy was performed 18 months before the child was conceived. It's biologically impossible for Marcus to be the father." "What should I do?" I asked. "I don't want to humiliate Rachel publicly, but I can't let her steal half of our home based on lies." David leaned back in his leather chair, considering the options. "First, we need more information about Rachel's current situation. People don't usually attempt fraud of this magnitude without serious motivation, usually financial desperation or mental health issues. I recommend hiring a private investigator to understand what's driving this behavior." He recommended Sarah Martinez, a former police detective who now worked as a private investigator, often on cases for David's firm. "Sarah is discreet and thorough. She'll help us understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." Sarah arrived within an hour of David's call, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a direct manner. She took detailed notes as I explained the situation, asking pointed questions about Rachel's financial situation, employment history, and relationship with Connor. "I realize I don't actually know much about Rachel's current circumstances," I admitted. "We've grown apart since Jake was born. I've been focused on helping with the baby, but I haven't paid attention to the bigger picture of her life." "That's common," Sarah said reassuringly. "Family members often assume they know more about each other's situations than they actually do. I'll need a few days to put together a complete picture. Can you give me Connor's full name and any other details about Rachel's recent contacts or activities?" I shared what little I knew about Connor Mackenzie and mentioned that Rachel seemed to have money for luxuries despite being unemployed. Sarah nodded, making additional notes. "I'll start with public records, court filings, debt records, employment history, and then expand from there. I should have preliminary information within 72 hours. 3 days later, Sarah called requesting an urgent meeting at David's office. When I arrived, both she and David were seated at the conference table, with files spread between them, their expressions serious. "Mrs. Chen," Sarah began once we were all seated, "I've uncovered some concerning information about your sister's situation that explains a lot about her current behavior." According to Sarah's investigation, Rachel was drowning in debt. She had accumulated over $60,000 in credit card debt, medical bills from Jake's birth and subsequent care, and personal loans from various sources. Her credit score had plummeted to the point where she couldn't qualify for additional legitimate credit. "She's also facing eviction," Sarah continued, sliding a document across the table. "This is a copy of the notice her landlord filed last week. She has until the end of this month to pay 4 months of back rent, nearly $8,000, or vacate the property." The news got worse. Connor had apparently abandoned Rachel and Jake shortly after the birth, despite what Rachel had been telling everyone. He'd moved to Seattle with a new girlfriend, leaving behind only sporadic child support payments of $200 monthly that arrived irregularly. "I also found these," Sarah said, producing printouts of text message conversations. "Rachel has been discussing her plans with several friends for weeks." The messages were between Rachel and her friend Amy Patterson, someone I remembered from high school but hadn't seen in years. "Rachel, Marcus's death is terrible timing, but maybe it's finally my chance to get what I deserve. That house has to be worth at least $650,000 now. Amy, are you serious? You can't just claim part of someone else's house. Rachel, why not? Elena's always been the golden child, everything handed to her on a silver platter. Time for me to get my share. Amy? But how would you even do something like that? Rachel, I've been working on it. Remember my friend Jake from the coffee shop? He's really good with computers and graphic design. We found Marcus's signature online from some charity. Auction photos. Jake says he can make it look totally legit. Amy, Rachel, that sounds illegal. Rachel, it's not illegal if it should have been true anyway. Elena got 11 years with a great guy, and now she gets everything? The least she can do is share the wealth. Reading those calculated, cold messages made me physically ill. This wasn't desperate grief or temporary insanity, it was premeditated fraud, planned while Marcus was still alive, and executed within days of his death. There's more, Sarah said gently, seeing my distress. I ran background checks on Connor Mackenzie. He has a history of domestic violence charges from previous relationships and currently has warrants out for unpaid child support for 2 other children in different states. The picture Sarah painted was devastating. My sister wasn't just financially desperate, she was involved with a dangerous man who had abandoned her and her child, leaving her to face massive debt and eviction alone. In her desperation, she decided to capitalize on my grief by destroying Marcus's reputation and attempting to steal our life's work. What are my options? I asked David after Sarah finished her presentation. You could file criminal charges, David explained. Forgery and fraud involving this amount of money would likely result in felony convictions and potential jail time for Rachel. Or, he continued, seeing my distress, you could handle this privately. Confront her with the evidence, require her to retract her claims, and potentially work out an arrangement that protects both you and Jake without involving the courts. I left David's office with a heavy heart and a folder full of devastating evidence. That evening, I called my therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, whom I'd been seeing since Marcus's death, and scheduled an emergency session. In her peaceful office, filled with plants and soft lighting, I unloaded everything: Rachel's betrayal, the forged will, the evidence of her desperation. I'm so angry I can barely think straight, I admitted. But Jake is innocent in all this. He's still my nephew, and despite everything, Rachel is still my sister. Dr. Kim listened carefully, asking questions about my relationship with Rachel throughout our lives. It sounds like this pattern of competition and manipulation has deep roots, she observed. The current situation is an escalation, not an anomaly. After much reflection and another sleepless night, I decided on my approach. I would confront Rachel privately with all the evidence, offering her a choice: face criminal prosecution for her fraud, or accept a compromise that would help Jake while requiring accountability from her. I called Rachel the next morning. We need to talk about the will situation. Can you come over this afternoon? Just you leave Jake with a sitter. I knew you'd come around, she replied, sounding smugly satisfied. I'll be there at 2. When Rachel arrived, I had everything prepared: recording equipment with her consent, water, and folders of evidence arranged on the coffee table. She seemed confident, almost victorious, as she settled into Marcus's chair. Before we discuss the will, I said calmly, I'd like you to tell me more details about this alleged affair with Marcus. Rachel launched into her rehearsed story: secret hotel meetings, Marcus's supposed unhappiness in our marriage, promises to leave me for her. As she spoke, I asked increasingly specific questions that only someone who had actually been intimate with Marcus would know. Her answers became vague and contradictory. Then I began presenting the evidence systematically. First, Marcus's medical records proving his vasectomy made fatherhood impossible. Rachel's face drained of color as she examined the documents. These could be fake, she whispered weakly. They're not, I replied, producing Marcus's legitimate will. And neither is this Marcus's actual will, properly witnessed and filed. Next came the journal entries documenting her inappropriate advances, the text messages planning the fraud, and Sarah's investigation revealing her desperate financial situation. We know everything, Rachel, I said, as she sat in stunned silence. Your eviction notice, Connor abandoning you, the $60,000 in debt. The question is, what happens next? Rachel broke down completely, sobbing with genuine anguish. I didn't know what else to do. Jake and I are going to be homeless. I was desperate. So you decided to destroy Marcus's reputation and steal from me while I'm grieving? I was desperate, she cried. You have everything: this house, your business, everyone's respect. What do I have? Her raw honesty reached something in me. Here's what's going to happen, I said firmly. You're going to publicly retract your claims and apologize. In exchange, I won't press charges. And I'll help you and Jake not by giving you my house, but by setting up a trust fund for Jake's medical and educational needs and helping you find stable housing. There would be conditions: therapy, steady employment, and allowing me to be part of Jake's life to ensure his well-being. Rachel agreed through her tears. I don't deserve your help. No, you don't, I said honestly. But Jake deserves stability, and I deserve to have Marcus's memory untarnished. 6 months later, Rachel had surprised everyone by genuinely embracing our agreement. Therapy had helped her recognize destructive patterns, and she'd found steady work. Our relationship remained formal but peaceful, centered on Jake's well-being. Standing in my garden one morning, watching the roses Marcus had planted bloom magnificently, I reflected on everything I'd learned. The most painful betrayals can reveal strength we never knew we had. Family relationships need boundaries to remain healthy. And sometimes love protects us even after death. Through careful preparation and honest documentation, Marcus's foresight had saved me when I was most vulnerable. His love continued to shield me, teaching me that true love endures beyond death, finding ways to protect those we cherish, even from beyond. If there's one thing I'd share with anyone facing family betrayal, it's this: protect yourself with both documentation and boundaries. Those who truly love you will respect those boundaries. Those who don't were never safe for you to begin with. Healing isn't linear, but it's always possible. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can give is preparing those we love for whatever challenges may come.